All right, so here's a review of the notes from Chapter 2, Section 1 on Egypt. And we divided this into really four big areas in terms of our standards. The first one is the area of geography. Now, the single most important geographic feature that the Egyptians had available to them was the Nile River. And this was what they used to provide water for farming, which was crucial to their population. It also helped, though, with trade and transportation because it provided them a waterway to move goods and people both north and south. In addition to the Nile, the Egyptians also had deserts on both the western and eastern borders, which provided protection. This helped to make sure they weren't invaded, so that protection allowed them to remain isolated and therefore develop. The other two things they had for protection were the cataracts, which were in the south in the Nile River, which were kind of like mini waterfalls, but this provided protection in that ships could not be traveling very easily and invade from the south. And then the last one was the delta, which was in the north where the Nile dumped into the Mediterranean, which also provided protection and kind of a safe harbor. If we move over, our next kind of area was on writing. Just like the early Mesopotamians and Sumerians, writing was used in the exact same manner for communication and record keeping. Now, the Egyptians also expanded and used it for some art and in part of their religion, but the basic two reasons of communication and record keeping were the same. The only real difference was the Egyptians did not have cuneiform, but they had developed a form of writing called hieroglyphics. And if we keep moving, we're going to go on down. We have this class division. Now, in the textbook, there was a class division or graphic organizer that had the 5 different classes, even though there were only 3, but they had 5 different groupings of people into those 3 classes. Now, the purpose of the class division was to help organize labor and determine people's jobs. So if you were in the lower class, that would determine where you were in society, but also would determine your work. And if you were in the upper class, it would do the same. Now, in Egypt, there were 3 major classes, the upper, middle, and lower, but both the upper and the lower had 2 kind of sections to it. And then we move over, one of our first famous people, or historically relevant people in Egypt, was the pharaoh Narmer. He also went by Menes. And Narmer was the Egyptian pharaoh that unified Upper and Lower Egypt. He did this through a war, an invasion, but the end result was a unified Upper and Lower Egypt, and that's his contribution to Egyptian history. Now, if we move on, the next section was Section 2, and for this section we did take notes, and some of the highlights or important information was we talked about the Old Kingdom rulers. And some important information about here was the name for an Egyptian king was a pharaoh. And in terms of what they did, they were all powerful and their word was law. So they were the major decision-making body. There was no Congress. There were no extra people. The pharaoh was the one in charge. Now, some beliefs around the pharaoh. The Egyptians did believe that their pharaohs were the son of Re, one of their gods. And in a literal sense, pharaoh interprets to mean great house. And then the last kind of area that we did talk a lot about was this issue of a dynasty or dynastic rule. And this is where power is passed down in a family. So very typically, when the father would pass away, his power would move to his son. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that if there isn't a son or if there's multiple sons. But generally speaking, a dynasty is when power is passed and kept in a family line. Now, the next area we talked at great length about was Egypt's religion. Now, Egypt's very basic, or one of their big beliefs, was this belief in an afterlife. And this really helped them in terms of 2 of the big things they are kind of known for. One of them is making mummies, or mummifying a body, or preserving a body. And they did this in order to prepare the body for their trip and life in the afterlife. And then the next thing they did was they built very elaborate tombs, and one of the most famous types of tomb was the pyramids. Later, Egyptians decided the pyramids were a bad idea because they were often robbed or looted, so they built tombs underground. One of the famous areas is called the Valley of the Kings. But these 2 actions were 2 very big actions the Egyptians did because of their belief in the afterlife, so the mummifying of the bodies and the building of tombs or pyramids. Now, next to that, we also do have their belief in many gods or deities, and they believe that these gods controlled nature or various forces and acts within nature. This is very common in early societies because they had a lack of understanding about science in the world, and so often things that couldn't be explained were often explained by the will or the act of a god or a goddess. And then we went down and talked a little bit more about this belief in life after death, and some of our vocab words that came out from our text was this word embalming, and this is just the process of preserving the body for the afterlife, or making a mummy. And then we had the Book of the Dead. Now this was just a holy book, a book of spells and prayers that they believed were used to help a body or help a person go and move into the afterlife. And then we have a mummy, which is a wrapped or a preserved body. And the reason we say preserved, because not all mummies were wrapped. Although the Egyptians wrapped their mummies, we do have a lot of examples of mummies not necessarily being wrapped. And then we move in and we talked a little bit about Egyptians' medicine. And it's kind of astounding, some of the medical advances they had. They're one of the first people to really put down their medical advice and medical knowledge into books, onto papyrus scrolls. And they also did create drugs and medicines to help treat illnesses. And then we had a lively discussion about this one, but they became very skilled at sewing cuts or stitches, and also the setting of broken bones. And then the last section of section 2 really talked about the pyramids. And quite simply, a pyramid is a stone tomb used to protect a pharaoh's body. And it would also hold a lot of the supplies that they believed the pharaoh would need for their journey to the afterlife. And then we did talk about and watched in a video about how they actually got the stone for these massive buildings, and it was done through local quarries, and it was done by hand. And then the big example we talked about was the Great Pyramid, which is on the plateau at Giza in Egypt, and it was specifically built for the pharaoh Khufu.